So is anyone else doing this any differently? I mean, is there anything else we might be able to try?
Russia, on the other hand, has been vitrifying or has vitrified a very, very large amount of similar waste using a glass form where you don't have to do a lot of this pretreatment. It's a sort of sodium phosphate or iron phosphate glass, which is very tolerant of impurities. But because it wasn't invented here, and more specifically, they didn't think about it at the Hanford site, there's a fierce resistance to looking at alternative technologies.
So, Bob, if this project were put in your hands, what would you say we should do?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that this is the largest, most expensive, and perhaps most riskiest environmental nuclear project that the United States has undertaken. This project, if you look at its current official estimated life cycle expenses, is somewhere in the ballpark of $110 billion. Roughly 20% of that total cost is the capital expense of building the facility. The rest has to do with operation. This facility is going to have to operate rather smoothly for many decades to get these wastes removed and stabilized. It is now being treated almost like a relatively obscure sideshow, whereas it should be treated as a project of national importance with a great deal of attention. One of the problems here is that there isn't a third-party safety overseer to this project. When this project was launched on its second or third iteration in 1996, when I served in the Department of Energy, we had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission come in with the goal of them having to license this facility. And they brought in 75 people and brought in a much different culture. I know that there's a lot of concerns and issues about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and its relationship with the reactor operators. In this case, as they say, the NRC did not have a dog in this hunt. They brought in some of their best people and started to sort of develop a system of regulations that would be light years ahead of what the department does. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulates safety through basically standards that are subject to fines and penalties that are developed in a relatively transparent way through the Administrative Procedures Act. They're binding. The Department of Energy, for the most part, regulates safety through contract clauses that can be changed without any public notice.
So, if I can get this straight, this waste product is actually vitrified with a solid glass ceramic compound, meaning it's not exactly put into a vessel, but it's combined with a solid glass or ceramic to make sort of a log, a solid piece of waste, which can then be easily handled by robots. Now, there are some studies that show that this might not last for more than 100 years. Can you talk about that, Bob?
Well, I think that the issue of the durability of this glass is theoretical anyway, and that what I'm afraid has happened is that a decision was made sometime in the early 70s to sort of pursue this particular technological fix, and all thinking stopped. So a lot of the proof is still in the pudding here and has yet to come out. The other problem with what they're trying to do here is that they're trying to reduce the number of glass logs that would go to a repository, because this is a very large volume of waste that has to somehow be dealt with. So their plan is to fractionate the waste. In other words, the waste in the tanks are in two basic forms, a soluble form and an insoluble form. The insoluble form is essentially the sludge that sits at the bottom of the tanks, and it contains over 90% of the heavy stuff like plutonium, strontium-90, and things like that. And then the liquids or salt cakes, which are soluble, sit on top, and that stuff contains over 90% of the very, very radioactive stuff, such as cesium-137. Their current plan is to separate out the soluble from the insoluble, somehow pre-treat the soluble material, the salts, and remove all that, as much radioactive cesium as possible, and dump that on site in a glass form, and to take the cesium that they are removing from the soluble phase and put it into the waste stream where they're going to be vitrifying mostly the sludge. This is turning out to be a little more complicated than they had thought because it involves a great deal of pretreatment. But the other big problem, technological problem or design problem, is that the department basically decided to go ahead with a design that was initially developed by British Nuclear Fuels, and they used what are called black cells. These are sort of hermetically sealed process rooms where once you seal them up, nobody goes in. There's no way to fix things once you go in. And if something goes wrong, this could literally cripple the whole operation.
So this vitrification process is a 35-year-old idea. Can you give me some sense of what the track record of it is?
They have been using this glass form. The first, really, if you want to call it test bed, was at West Valley, where this involved essentially one tank of high-level waste. And they've been able to generate glass logs with that. The Savannah River site in South Carolina has been operating a vitrification plant, but it has had big problems in terms of dealing with the 80-90% of the waste volume in these soluble waste forms. And that part of their vitrification plant is about 20 to 25 years behind schedule and way over budget.
So, Bob, is this technology ready for prime time?
I think it's unproven. The claim that it would hold up for these long periods of time, as I said, I think this is still in the realm of speculation. I think the problem here that we're looking at is a very similar problem to what we are looking at with respect to commercial nuclear spent fuel, is that we are putting the waste disposal cart before the safe storage horse. I think we need to start to think about building spare tanks at Hanford and establishing a much more responsible containment strategy for these wastes, given the fact that this technology is taking a very long time and costing a lot of money to even demonstrate it will work. I think that we also need to start to look at alternative technologies that can be demonstrated on a pilot scale. This may take longer, but when we made the first nuclear weapons during World War II, we built pilot plants. We didn't suddenly scale up from the University of Chicago's first reactor, or pile as it was called, and built these giant reactors at Hanford. There were pilot reactors built at Oak Ridge before that, before the larger reactors were built at Hanford. That lesson seems to be lost. There is this rush to build these very large plants with no proven history of success on what you call a design-build basis, which I kind of refer to as the ready, shoot, aim approach to design and safety. There's been so much pressure to stabilize these wastes and not much attention paid to the fact that these tanks that are holding these wastes are decades old. Most of them were constructed from the 40s through the 60s. Over a third of them have leaked, and their structural integrity really leaves much to be desired. And by the time we get around to removing the contents of these wastes and ultimately stabilizing them, these tanks could go into a stage of incipient collapse. And so there is sort of a real disconnect here between the matter of safe storage and disposal, because there is this rather false assumption, which I think people are deluding themselves into thinking this is the case, is that somehow disposal of these materials are just around the corner, when that's not in any way correct. The other thing is, I just wanted to mention, is that while we were talking about high-level radioactive waste, it's very important to understand that one of the main reasons why we are seeking to dispose of these kinds of waste in a deep repository is not only because of their very highly radioactive properties, which tend to last for several hundred years, but also the long-lived radiotoxic dangers of elements like plutonium. The Hanford site, during the course of producing all this plutonium, dumped as much as a metric ton of plutonium into the ground. And as best I can tell, the department has no intention of recovering this plutonium, which, at least according to some of their attenuation models, indicate that it could render the near shore of the Columbia River uninhabitable in less than 1,000 years. There are multiple challenges at Hanford, is what I'm saying. The high-level radioactive waste is perhaps the most difficult risky challenge. But then there's the matter of trying to remove and recover very large amounts of radiotoxic plutonium that eventually will reach the Columbia River.
It seems to me that Congress has not been paying enough attention to this over the years. And now we've got an aggressive senator, Senator Wyden, who's finally pushing Congress to take a look at this. Is there anything our listeners can do to persuade Congress that this is a pretty important problem?
Well, I think that it has to be recognized that this is an issue of national importance. We're talking about protecting one of the largest freshwater streams of the United States, the Columbia River. When I used to work out for the DOE and I had to go out to Hanford quite a bit, I would always ask people, why are you here? And it took a while for them to understand the reason they're there is to protect that river. And that is a matter of national importance. So I think if people value the resources of this country beyond their own backyard, they should start to pay attention to sites like Hanford. The Department of Energy's system of safety regulation is fundamentally broken. The department is now poised to dispose of approximately a ton of concentrated fissile material in the form of uranium-233 and 235 in a shallow landfill in Nevada because they don't want to spend the money to properly stabilize this stuff for geologic disposal. And I think the department is allowed to continue to move its goalposts like this. Don't be surprised if you see abandonment of high-level radioactive waste tanks at Hanford, or what they politely refer to as in-place disposal of large amounts of plutonium in the environment.
I can see why you and Arnie are old friends. Neither of you have good news. I'm hoping you'll come back on the show in the future and keep us updated as to what's going on at the Hanford site.
I'd be happy to.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And Arnie, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Kevin.
And that about does it for this week's show. Remember, you can catch us back here next week and every week for more on what's happening in the world of nuclear news and more technical nuclear discussion. Also, don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For Fairewinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.